it's just one big story, isn't it?
Hi everyone, welcome to the Story Connection. I'm your host, Donna Wilberg. Well, everyone has a story, and sometimes there's some really good stories behind the story. My guest is Dr. Tom Kando, and he's here to talk about his journey from another country into the United States and his experience as an immigrant. It's fascinating, and we're so happy to have him here today. Welcome.
Hello, I'm very glad to be here.
Well, let's start out with where were you born, and what was it like growing up as a boy?
Okay, so I was born in Hungary, in Budapest, at the beginning of World War II. And while it is no longer that rare for people to be immigrants to this country, of course, almost every American at one time originates that way, I feel that my story, my saga, is exceptionally eventful and interesting. Sometimes I joke that I had such a very interesting life. It's like the ancient Chinese curse that wishes you to have an interesting life. But really, I've lived in at least four separate countries, almost a decade in each, and moved to another 30 maybe, or at least traveled in 30. And I speak four languages fluently and dabble in another couple. Exceptionally international upbringing and background, and so I wrote my autobiography about this finally, although that's my first self-published attempt. Before that I had published many other books, the traditional way, academic textbooks and so forth. But I found it worthwhile to write all of this down at one point after I retired, because the saga involves my parents, my siblings, my sisters, trekking across Europe primarily as immigrants, as refugees, initially during the war and shortly thereafter, while the bombs were literally still dropping around us and pulverizing our own house and other ones in our neighborhood. So, and then later on, even after the end of World War II, when we moved to Paris, France first, where I lived 8 years, and then later on to Amsterdam in the Netherlands, where I spent the next decade, we were like gypsies, like practically living at times like homeless people. All the travel I did until my 18th or so year was hitchhiking. We couldn't afford trains, much let alone a car. The first car that was ever owned in my family was the one I bought when I was doing a little bit better in my mid-20s. So it was, like I said, a saga of hardship. And I know most people have sob stories to tell. I don't claim to be the only one that way, but I think the international character and the adventures, literally the adventures that we went through, the sleeping in city parks and on benches at railroad stations. All of that was pretty amazing, I think, and it would interest many others.
What really interests me and what boggles my mind is how someone can go through such trauma, such tragedies, such trials and tribulations, and end up in such a wonderful place.
Well, that's why, again, my autobiography or memoir, and I always have difficulty understanding the difference between those two terms, whatever you call it, describes, it's a little bit of a Horatio Alger saga of from hardship to success. Now, I'm not a multimillionaire, but I did finally end up with a PhD and a university professor's job for 40 years, and did well. Okay, I did well, and I raised children, and I have grandchildren as well, and I'm definitely doing okay. The American dream, to some extent. Now, I don't want to carry this too far. I'm a fairly liberal person who firmly believes that people need to be helped, and that without some kind of societal support, it is difficult for many people to climb up. And I don't truly believe that Horatio Alger and that the American dream is within the reach of everybody. There are many millions of people who need help and so forth. But somehow my own personal story, on the other hand, illustrates the possibility of doing well somehow. Maybe I was lucky. Maybe we were relatively had some skills and talents and aptitudes. Maybe I was lucky to be born not too stupid. Whatever it is, it worked out for me and for my sisters and for my mother, whom I talked to you about informally, who is now 101 years old and still lives in the old country in Holland, and who has done extremely well as a successful photographer. But that's all new. Again, if we go back to the middle of the 20th century when I grew up as a kid, it was amazing. It was really amazing, the difficulties, the poverty, basically.
Well, tell us about, do you want to share what it was like, what you remember?
Well, like as I said, I remember sleeping on benches in railroad stations as we had no lodging at times when we were kicked out by we were tenants, of course. Ownership was not, we didn't even know what that meant, but we were kicked out, and first they cut off the electricity, so to force us out. So I was doing my homework at candlelight. You know, I have pictures of that. My mother, being a photographer even back then, already took a picture of us, my sisters, and me doing homework by candlelight. I have a picture of that in this book, by the way.
Wow.
But so, you know.
Now, was this because of the war, or was this because of your poverty level that you weren't?
That's an interesting conjunction of personal circumstance and Europe being devastated. Because, you know, 45 was the end of the war, but until the late 40s, countries like, and by then we were in France, France was really struggling. Even 48, 49, I remember those years, France was in bad shape. There was violence in the subways, in the streets, and poverty. And as I said, when we wanted to go to the beaches, which were like 400 miles away from Paris, but so we hitchhiked to the beach and we camped out. You know, that's all we could do. And then, of
what
course,
a holiday, though! I bet you
exactly,
you had
the freedom,
yes.
freedom we had compared to the middle-class kids in our schools who looked down upon us. We had this freedom. We were bohemians, you know, and it was fun. You know, the discrimination was there. You know, filthy Hungarian, go back home where you belong, and that did happen a lot too. You know.
But you became so educated, so obviously the drive had to be there, and there must have been someone who was shaping you along the way. Was that your mother?
You know, that's an interesting question, because my mother, before the fall, before World War II destroyed everything, my mother grew up in a relatively upscale middle-class environment, because her father, my grandfather, was also a university professor back in Budapest. So very much the middle-class Jewish community we were a part of. And by the way, being Jewish didn't help very much in World War II, as you well know. So that's the whole other part of the story, where my grandparents were carted away into the Budapest ghetto and ready to be shipped out, but they survived because the war came to an end just before they were put on the trains to Auschwitz. So that's part of the story as well. And so I'm Jewish on my mother's side, and so, but you know, we survived. Although not all the members of my family survived. Some perished.
Now, because your mother was a photographer, did that give her any carte blanche with things? Was she able to?
Well, that's another interesting.
Because I heard that, you know, a lot of people who had specific talents were spared. Or given
no,
job.
Actually, it's not that she was spared. But by the way, she was a photographer by training, but of course, a starving photographer. But they didn't. Both her and my father, who has been dead for several decades now, used their skills to manufacture, produce, to create falsified documents for the people who had to go underground, Jews, of course. And now, when I was told this story as a teenager, I always thought, well, of course, this is always the story. People, after World War II, suddenly, people who had been allegedly saving Jews came out of the woodwork. Everybody had been in the business of saving Jews. Suddenly, everybody was a member of the resistance. And I didn't believe my mother when she was telling me these stories. Oh, sure, you know, I dismissed that as I was a teenage son. But then, in retrospect, now it appears to be true. And in fact, she is now listed at Yad Vashem on the Avenue of the Righteous in Jerusalem. As having done incredible work to actually create falsified documents for many people went underground. So it's true that they used those skills. Since you asked me what she was doing as a photographer, that's what comes to my mind, that she used those skills to, and then my father similarly did some pretty good heroic stuff during the war. So that's part of the story, but it goes on. I came over here and I was 18 on the boat, the old-fashioned way. When I saw Titanic some years back, Leonardo DiCaprio, I was so identified, except the boat, my boat didn't sink, but luckily, but I was in steerage. I was below, you know, you look at the porthole and it's green water out there.
Oh, boy.
And there was 8 of us in bunk beds in one cabin. You know, I was there in the cabin with 7 other immigrants.
Did you come by yourself?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I was there, you know, there was a Moroccan immigrant, there were a couple of Swedes, and so forth. Totally. There were 1,500 immigrants on that boat. It was 1960, and they used those old Liberty ships from World War II to cart over 15. It cost me $40, I believe, a one-way ticket from Rotterdam to New York.
Wow. So why did you want to come over here so bad?
Well, you know, America was the Mecca. Everybody. If anybody who didn't belong someplace and who was restless said, I'm going to America. It was America, you know. America was the future. America was the Holy Grail. It was the... And I must say, it was. Now, you know, America has some difficulties now. We all gripe, and many Americans are no longer happy campers now. We have turmoil, we have... But certainly, it's still great, okay? It's still a fantastic country. But, and whether it has been a relative decline, I don't want to get into that. But I'll tell you, but in 1960, America was the goal. It was, as a young man who didn't belong anywhere. I was a refugee. I was stateless. I didn't have a citizenship. I was not a Hungarian anymore because I had fled. I then became a French. I was not a Dutchman. I was nothing. So the first time I ever had a citizenship of my own was when I became naturalized as an American here in Sacramento at age 27.
Wow.
And my God, did that feel good. I had a citizenship. The judge interviewed me. He asked me some questions. He says, son, what is the Constitution of the United States? And I was fresh, brand new PhD. I was a first-year professor at Sac State. And I started pontificating. Well, the Constitution is the legal document that governs the rules. And he says, son, I'll tell you what it is. It's the law of the land. And he sent me home with a U.S. flag, and congratulations, you're now an American.
Sweet.
Oh, my goodness.
Wow. So you've taught at many universities and different places. You even taught at prison?
Yeah, I taught at Penn State for a number of years. I was kind of the big time and, you know, major. I taught at the University of California for a while, and then Sac State for several decades, and which isn't Harvard, but it was a fine job. I like the university here; it thrives. But yeah, and I spent some semesters teaching the prisoners actually at Vacaville, at the medical facility in Vacaville, and that's a zoo.
I bet you've got stories about that too.
Well, it was interesting. Never any trouble, you know. My students, prisoners, were rambunctious and always interrupting and laughing, and to them, you know, it was fun to take. I don't know if they still offer it.
What were you teaching them?
Not criminology. I tell you, I did teach criminology at Sac State for decades, but I would not want to teach criminology to criminals. But
yes,
there was some other sociology classes about. Actually, the sociology of the family, if I recall. I don't know why, but that's what they asked me to teach there. And but I don't know if they still offer tax-funded college education to murderers anymore.
I have no idea. So what was the most interesting topic that you've taught or involved yourself in?
Well, I'll tell you, I've published half a dozen books over the years. My very first book, I don't know if this is not the most important thing in my life. It's been 40 years almost, but my very first book actually was an interesting topic because it was based on 29 individuals who had undergone sex change operations at the University of Minnesota. I can assure you, I'm not a transsexual person myself, but I mean, when I start talking about this,
you sure look like Phil Donahue.
Oh my goodness!
I know.
Well, that's interesting. But so I did. You know, I was looking out for a PhD topic to write about, and most doctoral dissertations are incredibly boring. No one reads them. They're like dust on shelves.
Mhm.
So I said, and I saw in the Minnesota Daily in 1968 that the University of Minnesota was going to be one of the first in the country, along with maybe Johns Hopkins back east,
Mhm.
to operate some of these individuals. They were all male to female. And I said, oh my goodness, that would be an interesting topic to follow. So I joined a team of psychiatrists and social scientists and psychologists and surgeons, of course, medical profession, the team that was doing this project. And I was permitted to be part of the team and interview all of them post-operatively, and I got a book out of it. But, you know, that was a long time ago. So you asked me what is the most, maybe that's the most interesting topic.
Well,
But,
it sounds fascinating. I mean,
speaking
you
of
know,
Phil
to be the
Donahue,
breaking, yeah.
Speaking of Phil Donahue, I even sent him a copy of that book. I never got a response. So.
It's because you look too much like
I
him.
don't
You're
know.
probably intimidated. He
Whatever.
doesn't have a PhD, you
And,
know.
Well, whatever. But it didn't make me famous or rich, but it was at least, you know, I got
Yeah.
some research out on that. It was an interesting topic for a while.
So you've written a variety of books. You've written a murder mystery.
Well, later on, my regular books were academic textbook. I wrote books on recreation and leisure studies for a while because I got into that kind of research, and a couple of them did fairly well and sold many thousands of copies. But, you know, that's the fun way to do it. You go the old-fashioned way. You know, McGraw-Hill or someone comes to you and say, hey, Kando, write a book for us. Here's an advance of a few thousand. And then a year later, you turn in the manuscript, and after that, all you have to do is collect royalties, 10% or so, 10 or 12%. Nowadays, if you want to self-publish, it's a different ballgame because you have to not just write the damn thing, but then you have to promote and sell and have signing ceremonies and bookstores and so on. And I tried that with my autobiography, which is a dynamite story, but the promotional aspects are so time-consuming that anyway. So that's my experience I've written probably a dozen books and published almost 10 of them.
Aside from your textbooks, though,
Yes.
your topics seem to really, they're varied.
Extremely jack of all
yes,
trade, master of
yes.
none, they say.
But they're so
yeah,
interesting.
I
So
think
what I
so,
want to
yeah.
know is, do you get an inspiration to write about something? Does something spark you?
I'm very inspired all the time, even at my age. I still wake up in the morning and say, oh, this is what I want to write about. So lately, the last several years, it's been more like a blog on which I post these one-page little stories about many are political, some are little travelogues about being mugged in Rome or losing my way in the Dordogne area of France at night, and funny little travel anecdotes. And I publish those on the blog. And so it's fun to write things down, you know.
That's
It's,
great. So your experience as a criminologist, does that lend to your writing? Do you feel inspired to write about those kind of stories?
Criminology is an interesting field. I never really chose that, but my chairman at the university years ago said, hey, Kando, go over teach criminology because that's where the enrollments are. You know, sociology enrollments were suffering. Criminology department had students coming out of their ears. So I was transferred over. I could have said no. I mean, you're not forced to, but you know, I said okay. So then the next 15 or 20 years, I ended up teaching criminology and also the violence and terrorism class at Sac State. And so that's what I did for a number of years.
Was it fascinating?
Well, it's interesting, but you know, violence and terrorism was very topical, although when I taught it, was still, most terrorists were still European communists rather than Middle Eastern Muslim extremists, but so who the terrorist changes from year to year. But anyway, so I taught that for a number of years, and yeah, of course it's interesting, but it's grim, you know. I mean, I would rather teach popular culture, which I did as well, and then you get to play the Rolling Stones records in your classes, you know. That's more fun, you know.
I can imagine. Wow.
But yeah, I've done so many different topics and over the years, you know.
Well, one that really got my attention was the story that you wrote about the future.
Yeah, so there's another manuscript languishing, collecting dust in my drawers at home. I wrote this 400-page thing about the next 25,000 years. Modest effort, right? 25,000 years. I'm trying to predict. I mean, look, you go back 25,000, that's your Cro-Magnon. So it's the same amount of time as has lapsed since Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal man to now, as I'm predicting from now into the future. So it's been an incredibly fun exercise for me to do this. Now, whether it's good or not, I have no idea. Someone else has to judge it.
I would think it would take quite the imagination to even tackle,
exactly.
attempt
So
it.
it was fun to write it, and who knows, maybe someone will read it someday. But you know, it's like a trajectory of becoming. First of all, the world obviously has to unite. You can't have nationalism anymore. In a few thousand years from now, they're not going to be. Each country will be like one of the states within the U.S. You know, a confederation of states. And then the world expands and the planets become colonized, and then you move out. The big step will be at that point in 25,000 years from now. That's when we finally begin to consider moving out of the solar system into a. But you know, how do you do that? Because sub-light speed won't get you there in less than 40,000 years. So to the closest star, right? I think it would take about 40,000 years to get to Proxima Centauri at the speed of the space shuttle. So how do you get to the next star or sun is beyond me, unless Einstein's laws are violated, and I don't know how you can do that.
Well, it's going to be interesting. I
Yes.
want to read that book because I'm fascinated. Well, we've only got 5 minutes left in
Okay,
the show.
gone fast,
So
yes.
how about if you give your information? How can people look at your books and contact you and all that good stuff?
Well, there are a number of different ways to access this book. One, the paper version, which still contains, unfortunately, too many typographical errors. It's still a good read, but if you can get beyond that. The paper version can be ordered from me, for example, by emailing me at kandotom@csus.edu, so that's for California State University, Sacramento.edu for education. That would be one way. But the easiest way to get it is to go through to Amazon.com. And you know, my name is Tom Kando, Kando, and you can Google that too, by the way. Just type in Tom Kando and you'll see a lot of stuff about me, including my website. So that would be one way to do it.
Okay, and you have a blog, an ongoing blog?
Yes, the blog is called the European American blog, and it's done okay. We have about 200,000 hits so far, but it's more like, now of course some of it is political, and that might aggravate some people, so skip the politics, just look at the travelogue. Yeah.
You're just a feisty person, Tom.
Well, thank you.
And I love that.
I like to make it fun, yes. I hope it's what you were looking for, the interview and the talk.
Yeah, it's all good. Well, let's give a little bit of information about the Story Connection.
The Story Connection airs the second and fourth Thursday at 9:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Our companion show, Paranormal Connection, airs the first and third Thursdays of each month. Each episode repeats the following Friday at 1:30 p.m. and Saturday at 5:30 a.m. Watch these programs online at the same airtimes by going to accesssacramento.org and clicking Watch 17. In the Sacramento region, you can see us on Comcast Channel 17 and on AT&T Channel 99. You can find previously aired shows on the Story Connection YouTube channel. For information on upcoming shows and previous Story Connection guests, go to storyconnectiontv.blogspot.com. You can contact us at storyconnectiontv@gmail.com, and don't forget, find us on Facebook, become a friend, and become a fan.
So, Tom, in the few minutes that we have left, what would you like to impart to the audience?
Well, there's so many thoughts, but in my case, I feel that I have had an incredibly interesting life, and that despite many errors and much trauma and conflict and suffering, it's worked out pretty good. And so I would just urge people to remain fairly optimistic and not to be as negative as politics than to be, for example, today, and just to look at the things more positively and optimistically, because as I said, in my case, it's okay, you know, it's come out all right, and I'm getting old, and ailments afflict all of us as we get older, but you know, it's looking back, I think I'm fairly happy and proud and satisfied with what's happened to me, and I think that's within the reach of most people.
Now, does that come to light when you're writing a book? And by the way, A Tale of Survival. That's a perfect title.
Exactly.
Perfect title for a book, going through what you have. But just looking back and kind of mulling over your life, does that help kind of put it into a different perspective? I know when you're going through it, you're miserable. You're thinking, is this ever going to stop?
Yes.
But you reach a point where things are starting to get better, and you start looking back and you're applying the experiences that you had 25 years ago to today, and you're thinking, thank God I went through that, because now I'm using that experience to my benefit.
Oh, absolutely. I think in retrospect you can see it that way, that it makes a lot of sense. But I will add one thing to that. There's also a lot of luck.
Yeah.
Because I'll tell you, I could have ended up dead or behind bars or all sorts of, and you wonder, my God, I did take some risks.
Oh, is this another story?
Could be, but you know, luck is part of it too. You know.
Yeah. I have a feeling there's a lot that you're not sharing.
Well, that's true. That's true. And I don't want to. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we've only got a minute left,
Okay.
but is it in the book? Have you talked about any of these things in your book?
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
Okay.
there's a lot of sex and violence there.
Okay.
You know, so buy
Well,
it. Buy
there
it.
you go, folks.
That's it.
Got to get the book if you want to know the real story behind the story. Well, thank you so much, Tom, for coming on the show
My
and
pleasure.
sharing.
I really enjoyed this.
Yes, it's been wonderful.
Mm.
And thank you to my fabulous crew, Greg Parrish and Lisa Farr and Rick Stewart, who are here today, volunteering to make sure that the story gets out. So if you see us on the street and you know you've got a story to tell, we want to know what your story is. So thank you so much. And with that, we're going to say good night.
Good night. Thanks.
All right. Good night, everybody, and join us next time.